Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military with Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about several statements and different statements that were made by the Russians and by the United States of America about Ukraine and about things around Ukraine. So let's first talk about Donald Trump. Yesterday he had a call with the president of the Russian Federation, Putin, and he stated later that he just finished speaking by telephone with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. The call lasted approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes. We discussed the attack on Russia's docked airplanes by Ukraine and also various other attacks that have been taking place by both sides. It was a good conversation, but not a conversation that will lead to immediate peace. So very important situation. As you can see, once again, this is the most probably difficult question right now. The responsibilities of attacks on the Russian airfields, strategic airfields and strategic aircrafts. I'd remind you that there is an agreement by the name of New START between the Russian Federation and the United States of America, and according to this agreement, the Russians are forced to keep their aircrafts in the open air, which will allow the United States of America to check these aircrafts with satellites, which means that Ukrainians, when they were attacking those aircrafts, they were attacking basically aircrafts that were located under the security guarantees of the United States of America. And now the Russians are trying to find the truth, who is responsible for this situation. Basically, the Russians are trying to force the United States of America to make Ukrainians responsible for those attacks. Anyway, the Russians, most likely Vladimir Putin, when he was calling to the president of the United States of America, told him that the Russians investigators managed to find different parts or substantials of drones or explosives that were used by the Ukrainians of Western production, and which is most important, of the United States of America production, which means that basically the United States of America maybe not let's say for 100%, but has a partial responsibility for that attack because Ukrainians used parts made in the United States of America. So very difficult issue, very difficult question, but according to information we have today, the United States of America stopped sending some parts and substantials to Ukraine that Ukrainians used to use probably in drones or some other arms and equipment. Right after this call, another important thing came from the United States of America. The U.S. State Department issued a notice via the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, Ukraine, urging U.S. citizens in country to exercise necessary precautions due to the heightened tempo of Russian strikes in the past few weeks. So the United States of America and Donald Trump are trying to tell that something big is going to happen in Ukraine, and most likely the Russians are going to carry out very powerful missile or drone strike. As for now, it's very difficult to understand what exactly the Russians are going to attack. Either the Russians are going to attack the entire territory of Ukraine, or the Russians are going to attack just one target, but this attack is going to be very powerful. Of course, let's discuss the situation in Moscow. We have lots of very interesting statements, and the most interesting statements are coming from Putin, the president of Russia. An illegitimate regime is degenerating into a terrorist organization, and its sponsors are becoming accomplices of terrorists. Putin on terrorist attack in the Bryansk and Kursk region. The decisions on these terrorist attacks were made in Ukraine at the political level. Ukraine is suffering huge losses and is retreating along the entire front line, so it is trying to intimidate the Russian Federation with terrorist attacks. So this is very important because Putin probably, this is for the first time when he called Ukraine, Zelensky and his team a terrorist. Another important thing that was stated by Putin, that who negotiates with terrorists anyway? How to negotiate with terrorists? Why should they be rewarded by suspending military actions? So as for now, as for the end of the 4th of June and the beginning of the 5th of June, Zelensky was officially recognized as a terrorist by the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. And this is a very, very bad piece of news for Zelensky, because obviously the situation will have consequences. Now let's return back to the ground and let's discuss the situation along the line of combat contact. And first let's talk about the northern directions. And first and the most important video was published today by Ukrainian sources from the Bryansk region. The Ukrainians published this video, and according to the author of this video, the Ukrainians managed to discover the positions of Russian Iskander missile systems, and the Ukrainians reported that they managed to destroy them. Furthermore, the Ukrainians reported that in this video we can see how 3 Iskander missile systems were destroyed. The Ukrainians are saying that the Russians were planning to use these missile systems to attack in the direction of Kiev today, but somehow the Ukrainians managed to discover those positions and to destroy them. So anyway, we are waiting for additional probably reports from the Russian side, but as for now we haven't received anything special. Now let's talk about the Sumy direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. And first let's talk about the Tyotkina area. The Russians during the previous 24 hours carried out several airstrikes in the vicinity of the settlement of Tyotkina on the Ukrainian side of the border. So we see that the Russians were forced most likely to bring additional forces in this area and to send additional probably aircraft forces in this direction with the purpose to slow down Ukraine's attempts to attack. I'll remind you that since the beginning of May, the Ukrainians made hundreds of attempts to cross the border with the purpose to improve their positions on the Russian side. Most of those attacks were repelled, but despite the fact that most of those attacks were repelled, the Ukrainians managed to improve their positions, and currently the situation is very difficult, and telling the truth, the situation is critical around the settlement of Tyotkina. So when talking about this configuration on this picture, obviously the settlement of Tyotkina is an operational encirclement. The Ukrainians most likely have complete control over this supply line, the main supply line between the settlement of Tyotkina and the mainland. As for now, we don't have any video that can confirm, let's say, Russian losses along this, let's say, road, but obviously the losses are very heavy. So let's wait and see what is going to be next, but obviously the Russians are forced to maybe change some plans or to postpone some plans and offensive plans in the Sumy direction, let's say in the vicinity of the city of Sumy itself. As for now, they need to stabilize the situation there, because if Ukrainians continue the same way, obviously in a week or in two, they would be able to probably improve their positions and to take under control some building streets and probably some part of the settlements of Tyotkina and Popovo-Ležachi. Now let's talk about the Sumy direction, original Sumy direction itself. According to information we have, during the previous night, the Russians improved their positions, and the Russians improved their positions significantly. According to information we have, the Russians continue advancing from the villages of Andreevka and Kondrashevka in the southern direction towards the settlement of Khotin and the village of Pisarevka. Furthermore, today, according to information we have, the Russians finished the battle for the settlement of Yablunovka. So these are approximately Russian attacks during the previous 24 hours. And these are the changes. We have colored these fields to the south of Andreevka and Kondratovka, and we have colored the village of Yablunovka in Russian favor based on the report that was published by neutral mappers. So the Russians are about to finish the battle for the first defense belt, and when talking about the western flank of this offensive, the first belt was already taken by the Russians, and according to the latest progress on the ground, we see that the Russians are about to begin, or the Russians have already begun, the battle for the second defense belt for the settlements of Khotin and Pisarevka. So the situation remains tense for the Ukrainians, and as we expected and as we discussed during the previous videos, most likely the Russians are about to open another front line in this area with the purpose to attack the city of Sumy not just from the north but also from the east. Today, several pro-Russian resources reported that the settlement of Prokhody was captured by the Russians. This is the second village on the eastern flank that was taken by the Russians since the beginning of the Russian offensive operation. The first village that was taken by the Russians was the village of Marina. This settlement was taken probably 3 weeks or so ago, and now we got another report that another village in this area was taken. So when summarizing everything that was published by pro-Russian resources, currently the Russians control something like this to the east of the city of Sumy. And most likely the Russians are going to continue offensive. As for this direction, we understand that most likely the Russians are going to do the same thing as they are trying to carry out in the northern direction. The Russians will try to get as close as possible to the railways that go from the city of Sumy in the southern direction towards the city of Kharkiv. The same thing we can see in the north. So the Russians are taking in pincers the city of Sumy, and most likely if the things are going to be developed the same way, we believe that the Russians have all chances to seize control over the city of Sumy probably by the end of the summer. So anyway, let's wait and see what is going to be next, but the Ukrainians confirmed that the situation is very difficult. Now let's move further. Let's discuss the situation in the Kupiansk direction, and the most interesting updates are coming from the southern part of the Kupiansk area. We're talking about the Liman direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly. So let's take a look and let's compare the maps. This is the situation by the end of the 4th of June of 2025. The Russians just entered the territory of the village of Karpovka, and the Russians just finished the battle for the village of Ridkadup, and this information was confirmed by the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation. And today we started receiving reports that the Russians turned in the southern direction and began advancing in the direction of the city of Liman itself. Today the Russian sources first of all published this video, very important video, and this is something like 100% proof that the Russians secured the village of Ridkadup. In this video we can see how exactly the battle for the territory was taking place. Lots of explosions, artillery strikes, FPV drone attacks, and in the final part of the video we can see how the Russians were raising Russian flags in different parts of the village. Based on this video we did not adjust anything because we colored the territory of Ridkadup yesterday and in the days before yesterday, according to previous videos in the Minister of Defense report, but now we have both proofs, video proofs and reports of the Minister of Defense. But the most important adjustments are coming to the south of Ridkadup. We are talking about the settlement of Zelena Dolina. As you can see, according to the changes on the ground that took place here, the Russians managed to cut in cauldron Ukrainian positions and the armored forces of Ukraine on the territory of the settlement. The Russians managed to outflank Ukraine positions in Zelena Dolina from the north and the northwest, and the Russians managed to do the same but from the south and from the southwest as well. So this information was confirmed both by pro-Russian resources and by neutral mappers. So the village of Dolina is encircled. Ukrainians have no chances probably for evacuation. Most likely the Ukrainians who are still there would try during the day to break through this encirclement with the purpose to abandon their positions, to quit this cauldron and to get to the village of Shandrigalova, but the Ukrainians have very low chances to finish this mission successfully, so most likely Ukrainians would be forced to surrender. And after the fall of Zelena Dolina, most likely the Russians will continue further in the southwestern direction, and the Russians will try to attack the settlement of Shandrigalova at least from two directions, from the northeast, and of course the Russians would do this from the north. So Shandrigalova is the next target for the Russians after the end of the battle for Zelena Dolina, which most likely will be finished during the next several days. And then the Russians will shorten the distance to the city of Liman to the minimal level since 2022. Now let's move further. Let's discuss the situation in the Konstantinovka direction. The most important updates from this area are coming from the settlement of Yablunovka. This is a small village to the southwest of the Kliban-Byksky water reservoir. There are very heavy clashes in this area, and today we got additional changes on the ground. During the previous 12 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the most western part of the settlement, and according to geolocations we have, the Russians are getting closer and closer to the central part of Yablunovka. And when the Russians get to the central part of Yablunovka, this is going to be a turning point in the battle for this area. So in this video we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russians with FPV drones, with different types of drones. No, it's the Russians that were attacking Ukrainians while they were moving from the west in the eastern direction. All these attacks were carried out by the Russians. The Russians were attacking Ukraine positions, and somewhere in the middle of this video we can start watching how Russian soldiers began clearing every single building one by one. So in this video we can see Russian soldiers that dropped grenades inside of this building. Later we got another episode how the Russians cleared another building. So several buildings were geolocated, and one of the episodes took place exactly in this area. So we have proofs that the Russians are moving and that the Russians are clearing the settlement, and Russians are forcing Ukrainians to fall back. As of now we see that the Russians are still very far from the central part of Yablunovka, but we see that the Russians are moving in the eastern direction, and due to this situation we see that most likely in 1 or 2 weeks the village of Yablunovka and Alexandra Kalinova would fall in Russian hands. When talking about the situation of N32 road, the Russians improved their positions in fields according to different mappers. So these small territories were taken by the Russians. As for the South Donetsk direction, the Russians resumed their attempts to move further in the western direction, and currently the Russians are trying to outflank the settlement of Alexeyevka from the north, from the northwest, and from the east. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians improved their positions, trying to tighten the noose around Ukraine positions on the territory of the settlement. The Russians managed to improve their positions to the north and to the east by taking under control additional tree lines. So the situation in this area is very difficult, and most likely during the next several days the situation will become impossible for Ukrainians, and then either the Ukrainians would fall back from this area or they would stay there forever and be caught in cauldron. At the same time, the Russians continue their pressure, increasingly their pressure towards the village of Kamar. Today, several pro-Russian very reliable resources reported that the Russians managed to get as close as possible to the settlement of Kamar, and that the Russians just in several hundred meters from the settlement. So which means that most likely during this upcoming weekend the battle for this territory is going to start, and the Russians will answer this territory. Very interesting details and updates are coming from the Zaporozhye direction. As you can see, during the previous 12 hours we got lots of icons from this area. The Russians most likely started something, because during the previous day, as you can see, we got lots of icons of how the Russians were bombing and attacking Ukrainian positions, strongholds, temporary deployment points with the tall flamethrower systems. We have lots of videos and lots of map changes according to different mappers, and the most interesting is that the Russians shown us very big activities around the settlement of Gulyai-Polye. According to this number of icons and these artillery strikes, it seems that the Russians began something like artillery preparation, and it seems that maybe the Russians are planning to attack the settlement of Gulyai-Polye. It will be unexpectedly, because I didn't expect that the Russians can attack the village of Gulyai-Polye from the south before getting this territory from the east, from the settlement of Zelene Polye, but everything can happen. And telling the truth, since the beginning of the special military operation, we haven't seen any clashes around Gulyai-Polye. This front line hasn't been changed since 2022, and maybe now the Russians decided to carry out fast lightning and unexpected attack, which can lead to complete collapse of Ukraine positions. Everything is possible. We have lots of activities, so let's wait and see what is going to be next. And that's it for today, for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.